Next, we have with us Mr. Siddharth Shetty, analyst Bloomberg NEF, and he is going to talk about India's green hydrogen mission, Buoyed by policies and private sector. With this, sir, please, over to you. And everyone, can we give sir a huge round of applause? Thank you for joining and giving your time here today.
Good afternoon, everyone. I understand it's lunchtime and I've eaten a bit into your lunch, so I'll try to keep this as interesting and as short as possible, given that hydrogen has been an interesting landscape in India so far. At Bloomberg NEF, we cover a whole range of things under the energy transition umbrella. You start from clean power, you go to hydrogen, everything in between. And someone like me who usually covers wind and long-term energy modeling in India couldn't keep me away from hydrogen, especially with the recent developments. And green hydrogen, as I mentioned, is quite new to India, so a lot of policy support is required. And that's where the federal support has come in. So there's been a lot of federal support when it comes to this sector, starting off with the National Green Hydrogen Mission, which basically tries to establish or targets setting up 5 million metric tons of green hydrogen production capacity by the decade end. Okay, thank you. And to do that, they have come up with a 2.4 billion incentive scheme to ensure we meet that target. And through that, it also wants to support the whole energy transition with clean power and plans to add about 125 gigawatts to support the green hydrogen ecosystem. And what we did is try to analyze what National Green Hydrogen Mission actually means. And we actually found out there's a whole lot of supply and demand side support that comes for establishing the green hydrogen production. Firstly, coming on the supply side, it's providing subsidies to establish your electrolyzer manufacturing capacity or your green hydrogen production plants. You provide subsidies to establish those. But it's also a big chunk of green hydrogen production costs actually comes from clean power costs. And that's where they're trying to enable cheaper clean power reach these production plants. That's through giving you a national grid transmission waiver. So you can set up your renewable project somewhere in Rajasthan or Gujarat where you have good production profiles, generation profiles, and you can put your green hydrogen production plant on the coast where you typically have more export opportunities. And the other thing that was essential to ensure you get cheap and clean power is by exempting some of these projects from ALMM or RLMM, which are basically non-trade tariff barriers to restrict Chinese imports. So that's how the government is trying to boost the supply side. But the question is also on the demand side of things. So now they're rolling out programs to provide incentives or run pilot projects so that you can use this green hydrogen in steel industries, fertilizer industries, refineries, and so on. And closing the loop is also quite important. It is planning to roll out incentives to establish what we call green hydrogen hubs. These are basically industrial clusters where you have production and consumption of green hydrogen over 100,000 tons per annum. So the whole National Green Hydrogen Mission is about closing the loop both on the supply and demand side. And because there's been so much of green hydrogen announcements going on, states are also racing to capture a piece of the pie. So India's green hydrogen production target is about 5 million metric tons, but then states came up with their own targets. Gujarat, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan were some of the major ones. And put them together, they are much larger than what India's federal target is. So India's federal target, as I mentioned, is 5 million metric tons, but you put the states together and they have 7 million metric tons altogether. Some of these policies are in draft stages, like Punjab and Haryana, but when you put all of these together, they're much, much more than what the federal level targets are. And what we also try to do is analyze what kind of support these states actually offer. And mind you here, these are the states that actually have a dedicated green hydrogen policy, not one that is integrated or has a mention of green hydrogen. So these are policies where it's adopted or in draft stage, and they're purely for green hydrogen. So what we see is that Uttar Pradesh and Maharashtra actually offer capital subsidies. Punjab, to some extent, offers only for biomass production pathways, but Maharashtra for the first few projects. But it's actually Uttar Pradesh that is actually leading the way when it comes to providing capital subsidies. It also provides land allotment benefits to producers of green hydrogen. And as I mentioned, clean power is a big component of green hydrogen production costs. So most of these states actually offer electricity transmission waivers or rebates on cross-subsidy surcharges. So that's where, when you put it together, a lot of the states actually offer more on the clean power side, but lesser so in terms of capital upfront subsidy for green hydrogen production projects. And as I mentioned, Uttar Pradesh is actually the most generous when it comes to offering subsidies. It has a target of 1 million metric tons by 2029, which is about their current gray hydrogen demand. And it offers up to 40% of capital subsidy for select projects. It varies from all the way from 10% to 40%. And this is depending on the location, the size of the project, the amount of employment you sort of provide. So it's not just about green hydrogen that they're focusing on, but they're also about local content value addition, providing employment, and different boosters that you get on the subsidies. And another interesting fact is they offer land at a very cheap rate to these green hydrogen producers. So if state-owned firms, which is basically PSUs, go and set up their green hydrogen production plants in Uttar Pradesh, they are given a very cheap rate of 1 rupee per acre per year for their green hydrogen production plant. And if it's a private firm, it goes up to 15,000 rupees per year. But the biggest question is actually, do they have access to port infrastructure? That's key, because if you want to export your green hydrogen, it is quite challenging if you're not near the coast or you don't have a coast. So most of the investments in green hydrogen recently are actually focused on Gujarat, Karnataka, Odisha, and Andhra Pradesh. And all of these, actually, it's Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh alone which have a green hydrogen policy. Gujarat is coming up with one, and Odisha has an integrated RE policy, but not a dedicated policy. But most of the announcements and investment is actually happening in these states which actually have a coast, because most of these private investors are looking to export their green hydrogen while the internal market still is yet to mature. And the question I would have at the end of the day is not just having policy, it's also what does it imply and how does it actually boost the ground establishment of electrolyzer manufacturing or green hydrogen production. Now, before we get to that, I would try to understand what actually influences the cost of green hydrogen production. It's CapEx. So the lower the CapEx, it's easier to get to your targets of $1 or $2 per kg. So it's about lowering your CapEx. And typically, your Western CapEx, Western electrolysis CapEx is typically higher, which is $2,000 to $3,000 per kilowatt. But the Chinese ones are typically between $400 to $700 per kilowatt. So it's also about bringing down your CapEx. And the next thing that you should focus on is actually ensuring you have sufficient utilization of your electrolysis system. So we found, based on our analysis, our sweet spot is between 60 and 70% utilization rate. So when you enter this range, typically you can bring down your electrolysis cost of green hydrogen production significantly down. And what I would say, what we find from this is actually that when you shift from the Western CapEx to Chinese CapEx, you can bring down your cost of hydrogen by 50%. And that's important for a market like India. Recently, I'm pretty sure some of you would have heard, Greenco has arrived at a final investment decision for its electrolysis system, green ammonia plant in Andhra Pradesh, in Kakinada. And what we actually found today is that their CapEx is much closer to China than it is to Western. So that's sort of good news for the market. And I would like to end this on a much better news for the Indian market, is that if you get to 60% utilization, coming close to $3 per kilogram is not that difficult. It's not a hypothetical dream. And if you stack up all the subsidies, so you get to $3 using Chinese alkaline electrolyzers. You try to use the cheapest solar modules available, the wind projects that are available, and you stack up all these subsidies on them. So you take the federal subsidy, which comes for electrolyzer manufacturing and green hydrogen production. You stack it up, and then you strategize such that you place it in the right place. In this case, we have taken Uttar Pradesh, where we put it in the state and took a subsidy of 30%. So you put all of these together. It's not far enough for green hydrogen to compete with gray hydrogen. We found that gray hydrogen is typically in the price range of $2 to $2.4. So you stack up all of these subsidies in a hypothetical situation where you maximize all of it, then you can sort of compete with gray hydrogen. And last but not least, based on our forecast, India's electrolysis capex is, by the decade end, can undercut Chinese. And that's because we have very cheap labor. So all in all, it's pretty good news for the Indian market when it comes to green hydrogen. It's all about getting it executed and getting the sector moving. Thank you.